Pyre has many of the hallmarks found in Supergiant's other games. There is great care given to the soundtrack, there is always a musician, there's a narrator, there's a system that increases the difficulty in exchange for more experience. Despite these similarities, the developers at Supergiant made some radical changes to the general formula laid out in Transistor and Bastion. Perhaps the largest change that Pyre made can be found in the game's approach to failure, which not only distinguishes it from other Supergiant games, but also most other games on the market. For those of you who haven't played it, Pyre is a fantasy sports RPG. The game takes place in the Downside, a barren wasteland where criminals must serve out their lifetime sentences, never again to return to the Commonwealth. That is, unless they compete in ritualistic sporting events known as the Rites, to earn the favor of the Scribes. With enough favor, teams earn the opportunity to compete in Liberation Rites, where the victorious team can send home one of their players. This is the world the player is presented when they play Pyre, and this setting is used to support the mechanics and narrative of the game through its framing of player failure. Mechanically, Pyre is similar to a game of 3v3 basketball, where the player needs to cast the celestial orb into their opponent's pyre. Just like most real-life sports, there will always be a winner and a loser, and the player will probably taste the sting of defeat at some point along their journey. However, Pyre's approach to failure is quite different than the approach most games take to respond to failure. For instance, consider Bastion. In this game, if the player takes enough damage, they will eventually die, and they are sent back to the beginning of the level. Compare this to Pyre, and you will see that these games have very different approaches to failure. In Pyre, if the player loses a right, they aren't sent back to the beginning to try again. Instead of taking the player back to an earlier point as a punishment for their failure, the game continues on, forcing the player to come to terms with that failure. This permanence might sound similar to the way XCOM, Into the Breach, Fire Emblem, and many other games approach failure, but there are some important differences that significantly affect the player's experience of that failure. For most other games with permanent consequences, failure can set the player back significantly. For instance, consider XCOM. If one of your high-level soldiers dies on a mission, you'll need to replace them with a weak and fragile rookie, which are more likely to die on future missions. In comparison, Pyre has practically no punishment for failure. For most games, losing only means that you get slightly less experience. In fact, Pyre was designed not to have any failure states of any kind, which presented the developers with some significant advantages. Allowing players to continue the game even if they fail makes the game much more accessible for people who don't play many games, or for people suffering from disabilities, who would otherwise be unable to experience Pyre's story. And speaking of that story, this approach to failure can help with that too. Games trying to tell a dynamic story while also trying to include difficult gameplay segments have to maintain a very difficult balance between providing the player with challenging gameplay without that challenge ruining the pacing and immediacy of the story by halting the player's progression through the game. Maintaining this balance is difficult because the dynamic story requires forward momentum. That's what dynamic means. But the gameplay can act as a contrary force that slows the player's progression through the game's dynamic story. Unlike most games, Pyre is free to include very challenging gameplay alongside a character-driven plot without the fear that the gameplay would destroy the pace of the narrative because no matter what happens, the story moves forward. It is important to note that not every game can do this. Supergiant's previous games put the players into shoes of single characters in a desperate fight for their lives, and removing failure states from these games would be nearly impossible to justify within their narratives. Pyre is able to remove its failure states because its story focuses on a large cast of characters competing in non-lethal competition. Since the game doesn't reset if the player fails a right, the developers had to write dialogue that accounts for player victory and failure. This monumental task is compounded by the fact that Pyre has a cast of 10 characters, who can join the player's party, and may or may not be present at any particular time in the story, depending on the player's actions. Even though Supergiant ended up writing thousands of lines of dialogue to account for every possible permutation, the end result was worth it. This method of writing is capable of telling very personalized stories that respond to the player's choices and performance within the game. It is through the quality of this writing that Pyre raises the tension and makes the player care about the outcome. If you were to strip away all of the graphics, music, and narrative from the game, leaving only the barest husk of game mechanics, the player probably wouldn't care very much about whether or not they won or lost a match. But when each fight is a fight for freedom for a character that you have spent hours with, the stakes are much higher, and the player is much more invested in the outcome. In my second liberation rite, I attempted to free Jodariel, the exiled guard who was banished to the downside for raising a family of orphaned harps, whose people are the sworn enemy of the Commonwealth. I liked Jodariel, and I desperately wanted to ensure her freedom, but I failed on this attempt, and she remained in the downside a little while longer. This loss devastated me, not because I was punished mechanically, but because the writing had made me care about the well-being of these characters. What I love about failure in Pyre is how it is implemented into the narrative themes of the game. Just like on a real-life sports team, you care about your team and you want to lead them to victory, and sometimes things just don't go your way. Pyre is a game that tells the player that they will fail, and in real life, you cannot rewind time to fix your failures. All you can do is pick yourself up and try again. Instead of rewinding time to fix your failures, Pyre is a game about accepting your failures and moving on with your life. In that respect, Pyre is an exploration of Stoic philosophical principles. According to Stoicism, you have little control over the events around you. In fact, the only thing you have complete control over is how you respond to your circumstances. You can choose to get angry with the world when it brings you failure. Or you could realize that everyone experiences failure, and you can use it as an opportunity for self-improvement. You can choose to see the good in even the bleakest of situations. In fact, Pyre intentionally does not have good or bad endings, oftentimes found in games with branching narratives, opting instead for a bit of both no matter what happens. Even if the player manages to win every single liberation rite, there will still be some members of the player's party left behind in the downside, forever separated from their liberated friends. On the other end of the spectrum, the player might fail every single game, but through the journey you develop closer relationships with the other party members. Sure, no one got sent home, but at least everyone can live out their days together as friends. Pyre forces you to ask some tough questions about freedom and failure over the course of the game. Everyone you meet on your journey is a criminal, but the game forces the player to decide who deserves forgiveness for their failures. In a way, everyone deserves forgiveness for their crimes. Ruki only became a smuggler to support his family. Hedwyn had mercy on his enemies. Wolfred ran a printing press. Sir Gilman is in self-imposed exile because of survivor guilt. If this band of exiles can be deserving of forgiveness, perhaps the player will realize that they are worthy of forgiveness too. That is one of the reasons why I love this game. It forces you to live with your failures, but it does so in a way that lets you realize that your failures shouldn't define you, and you can grow past them with the right perspective. Thank you for making it this far into the video. If you haven't already done so, consider subscribing to my channel to be notified of my future videos. If you found this discussion of failure interesting, I would recommend this excellent video from MML Commentaries. My video was originally much more focused on how Pyre mechanically framed failure, but after some rewrites I ended up shifting the focus of the video to Pyre's narrative. MML's video dives much more into how failure is presented mechanically in the Wario Land games. I also wanted to announce that I now have a Discord, so if you want to come and talk to me, the link will be in the description below. Anyway, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.